It was a typical busy morning at one of the world's busiest airports. A sleek, modern airplane stood waiting at the terminal, its engines humming softly as passengers trickled through the boarding gates. Among the crowd was a family of 4, a mother, father, and 2 young children, all dressed in high-end clothing. The father, tall and broad-shouldered, wore dark sunglasses, his calm demeanor hiding any trace of the wealth he carried with him. As they boarded, the flight attendant, a young woman in her mid-20s, was making her final rounds before the flight took off. She checked tickets, greeted passengers with a professional smile, and ensured everything was in place for a smooth journey. Everything seemed normal until she reached the family of 4. The father, noticing the attendant's approach, smiled warmly, offering a quiet hello as he adjusted his jacket. But the attendant barely glanced at him. She had her own set of rules about who should be treated with respect and who is worthy of attention. She was tired of dealing with entitled passengers, and frankly, this man didn't seem to meet her standard. The family took their seats in first class, the children squirming with excitement, and the father settled into his chair, looking out of the window. However, things quickly went south when the flight attendant walked down the aisle to begin serving drinks. "Excuse me," the father said, raising his hand. "Could we get some attention over here, please?" The attendant, clearly agitated, turned and walked over to the family with a forced smile, her thoughts far from polite. "Yes, sir?" she asked, her tone cold and distant. "We would appreciate it if you could bring out some drinks," the father said again, this time a little firmer. "Perhaps some water for the kids?" The attendant, already irritated by the tone, barely nodded and began to walk away, muttering under her breath. She didn't care much for rich people, especially ones who didn't understand what it meant to be real people. As she reached the beverage cart, she spoke sharply to her coworker, rolling her eyes. "Another one of those entitled families," she grumbled. "I just want to get through this flight without any more attitude." She grabbed the water bottles but returned to the family with even more resentment in her step. Without saying a word, she shoved the bottles onto the tray in front of them, the water splashing out a bit as she did. The father, who had been calm up until now, looked at her in surprise. "Is there a problem, miss?" he asked, trying to understand why her behavior had shifted so drastically. She didn't even look up as she snapped, "No, there's no problem. Just make sure you drink your water." With that, she turned away without a second glance. The father, who had been trying to keep the peace for the sake of his family, clenched his jaw. But before he could respond, his wife, sensing the tension, touched his arm. "Let it go, honey," she whispered, trying to calm him down. But the damage had already been done, and the father wasn't one to let things slide, especially when it came to respect. He decided to handle it later, but for now, he let it pass. The flight went on, and the family tried to enjoy the rest of the journey, even as the attendant's cold attitude lingered. But little did she know, the family she had just treated so poorly wasn't just any ordinary family. As the flight neared its destination, the captain came on the intercom to announce that they would be landing shortly. But he also had something important to say. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "I would like to take a moment to express our gratitude to one of our very special passengers today. This flight is being sponsored by a generous donation from one of the wealthiest and most influential people in the world." The flight attendant, who was still preparing the cabin for landing, didn't even pay attention. She was too busy organizing her things, unaware of the significance of the announcement. She went about her duties, oblivious to the fact that the man she had treated so badly was about to be revealed. As the captain continued, "Mr. Jonathan Carter, who's with us today, is the owner of several major corporations, including the airline you are currently flying with. We thank him for his continued support in making air travel more accessible and enjoyable for everyone." The attendant's hands froze midair, her eyes wide with shock as the name hit her like a ton of bricks. Jonathan Carter, she had heard that name before, of course. Everyone had. He was one of the richest and most influential men on the planet. He owned more than just the airline, he controlled multiple industries. She felt the blood drain from her face as she slowly turned her gaze to the man she had been so rude to. There, sitting in first class, looking completely unbothered by everything that had transpired, was Jonathan Carter himself. His wife, still smiling softly, exchanged a glance with him, as if they were in on some private joke. The flight attendant could barely process it. The captain's words echoed in her mind, a broken-by owner of several major corporations, including the airline you are currently flying with. And that's when it hit her, this was his airline. She had just treated the owner of the company like garbage. She had disrespected him in front of his family, and now, in front of all the passengers. The realization struck her like a punch in the gut. The rest of the flight was uneventful, but for the attendant, it was a whirlwind of humiliation and regret. She spent the remaining hours pacing, wondering if she could somehow apologize, though she knew that any apology now would seem insincere. It was too late. The damage had been done, and there was no taking it back. As the plane landed, she did her best to keep her composure, but it was clear that the event had shaken her. Jonathan Carter and his family disembarked calmly, with the same grace and poise that they had displayed throughout the flight. No fuss, no drama. The father even gave her a quick, polite nod as he passed by. But it was the last look she caught from him as they walked down the jetway that stung the most. It wasn't a look of anger or confrontation. No, it was a look of quiet disappointment, as if he had expected better from someone in her position. It was the look of someone who had seen enough of this kind of behavior to know it wasn't worth getting upset over, but it still hurt. After the passengers had exited, the flight attendant went to the back of the plane, her hands trembling. She could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her. It wasn't just that she had disrespected a billionaire, it was that she had let her biases and her frustrations cloud her judgment, leading her to treat a person with complete disregard simply because of his wealth. And that, she realized, was the real lesson: never judge someone by their appearance, status, or assumptions. You never know who you're dealing with, and today, she had learned it the hard way. It would be a long time before she could forget the lesson she learned that day. She had been so quick to judge and so certain of her position that she had overlooked the most important thing: treating people with kindness and respect, no matter who they are. It was a mistake that cost her much more than just a few seconds of her time. The following days were a blur for the flight attendant. She couldn't shake the feeling of discomfort that had settled deep within her. Every time she closed her eyes, the image of Jonathan Carter's calm, almost indifferent face would flash in her mind. The disappointment in his eyes haunted her. It wasn't just about the job anymore, it was about something deeper, something personal. She had failed herself, not just the passengers or her employer. Back at the airline headquarters, news of the incident began to circulate. It wasn't long before the incident found its way to the upper management team. The flight attendant had no idea how the company would handle it. Would she be fired? Would there be disciplinary actions? She had heard stories of employees being dismissed for far less, and the gravity of her mistake made her sick to her stomach. She was summoned to the office of her supervisor. Her heart raced as she stepped into the polished, corporate world that felt so far removed from her day-to-day reality. The supervisor, a stern-looking woman in her mid-40s, sat behind a large desk, flipping through paperwork when she walked in. The tension in the room was palpable. The supervisor looked up, but didn't immediately speak. Instead, she stared at her for what felt like an eternity. "Take a seat, please," the supervisor finally said, her voice low and controlled. The flight attendant sat, hands clenched tightly on her lap. She tried to keep her composure, but she could feel the anxiety rising. She had no idea what was coming next. "You know why you're here," the supervisor continued, her eyes narrowing. "There's been a broken bar situation. The passenger in question, Mr. Jonathan Carter, the owner of the airline, has made his feelings known about the incident. He was deeply offended by your behavior." The flight attendant's stomach dropped. She could already feel the sting of the reprimand, and she hadn't even been told what exactly was going to happen. Her mind raced, trying to think of an explanation, a way to apologize, to make things right. Mr. Carter doesn't want you to lose your job, the supervisor continued. He was, however, disappointed. And we have to be honest with you, his displeasure wasn't just about the way you treated him personally. It was about your lack of professionalism and, frankly, your inability to embody the values of our company. The flight attendant nodded, feeling a wave of shame wash over her. She knew she deserved every word. But what came next, she hadn't anticipated. He also suggested you attend a course, the supervisor added, looking over some notes on her desk. A course on custom relations and empathy. I've already arranged it. You will have to take some time off to attend these sessions, but you'll keep your position. Mr. Carter is a man of second chances, he believes in redemption. The words hit her like a lifeline thrown into a storm. She had expected the worst determination, perhaps, yet here she was, being given a second chance. But the weight of the situation wasn't lost on her. She wasn't just being given a chance to learn, she was being handed a rare opportunity to grow, to become someone better than the person she had been. The supervisor's tone softened slightly. This is your final warning. If something like this ever happens again, the consequences will be far more severe. Mr. Carter has shown mercy, but that mercy is not indefinite. The flight attendant left the office with mixed emotions swirling within her. On one hand, she was relieved, almost grateful. On the other hand, she knew she had to work hard to earn back the trust of not just Jonathan Carter, but her colleagues, and, most importantly, herself. In the weeks that followed, she immersed herself in the custom relations courses. The classes were intense, challenging her perceptions of human interaction, service, and the value of empathy. She learned that every passenger, no matter their status, background, or wealth, deserved respect, not because of who they were or what they had, but because they were human beings. The lessons were humbling, forcing her to confront her own biases and assumptions. The flight attendant began to understand that the arrogance she had shown toward Jonathan Carter was more about her own frustrations with life than anything else. She had been resentful of the idea that wealth somehow entitled people to better treatment, but what she hadn't realized was that true wealth of character, of kindness, was something everyone, no matter their income, should strive for. She had to make it right. She had to find a way to face Jonathan Carter and apologize, not just as an employee, but as a person who understood the depth of her mistake. And so, one afternoon, a few weeks after completing the course, she took a deep breath and asked her supervisor for a private meeting with Mr. Carter. It was a long shot, but she felt compelled to apologize in person. To her surprise, the supervisor agreed, and soon enough, she was standing in front of the door to Jonathan Carter's office. It felt surreal, walking into that space, knowing it had been his domain all along. The man who owned the airline, who had the power to fire her without a second thought, but who had chosen to show mercy. He was sitting at his desk when she entered, his expression unreadable. The same calm, composed demeanor from that flight was there, and she could almost feel the weight of his influence pressing down on the room. Mr. Carter, she began, her voice steady but nervous. I owe you an apology. I was rude to you, and I disrespected you in a way that was unacceptable. I was wrong, and I understand the impact of my actions. I want you to know that I've learned from this mistake. I've taken courses, and I'm working hard to be better, to approach my job and people differently from now on. There was a long pause. Jonathan Carter looked at her for a moment, his gaze intense. Then, he leaned back in his chair and spoke. I appreciate you saying that, he said, his voice calm and measured. You know, everyone makes mistakes. What matters is what you learn from them. I didn't expect you to apologize, but I respect that you did. The flight attendant swallowed hard, grateful that he hadn't dismissed her outright. Thank you, she whispered. He nodded, his eyes softening just slightly. Just remember that this job, this company, is about respect. Not just for the passengers, but for each other. If you can carry that with you, you'll do well. And with that, the conversation was over. He didn't hold any grudges, but he made it clear that it wasn't just about her. It was about everyone and how they treated one another. As she left his office, the weight of the situation finally began to lift. She wasn't just a flight attendant anymore. She was someone who had learned the hard way that respect, humility, and empathy weren't optional. They were essential. And she knew that from that moment on, she would carry those lessons with her into every interaction, every journey, every flight. Her second chance wasn't just about keeping her job, it was about becoming a better person, inside and out.